Summer 1941. The Soviet Union trembles under the thunder of German tanks. Cities collapse, armies retreat, and the world seems to believe that the Red Giant is about to fall. In those chaotic days, one question haunted millions. Where was Joseph Stalin? What was the leader of the Soviet Union doing while the very existence of his country was threatened? Rumors spread even during the war itself. Some claimed Stalin had withdrawn in shock, paralyzed by the scale of the catastrophe. Others insisted he was calculating every move with icy precision. And decades later, historians still argue, was Stalin absent in the most crucial moment of the war, or was he the ultimate architect of Soviet survival? This is the story of Stalin's war, a journey through secrecy, myths, and hard facts. June 22, 1941, the collapse of illusions at dawn. The Nazi war machine launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. Millions of soldiers stormed across the Soviet border. But where was Stalin at that moment? Documents suggest that he was at his Kuntsevo dacha near Moscow. He had been warned repeatedly by intelligence agencies that Hitler was preparing to strike, but he refused to believe it. When the inevitable came, witnesses claimed that Stalin was shaken. Some say he sat in silence, chain-smoking, unable to process the scale of the disaster. Instead of speaking to the nation, he allowed Molotov, the foreign minister, to announce the invasion. For ordinary people, the absence of Stalin's voice on the radio was shocking. In their darkest hour, the father of nations seemed to vanish. Did Stalin truly withdraw? Or was this part of a carefully constructed myth that grew after his death? This is perhaps the most debated mystery of Stalin's wartime role. From June 20 to June 29, there are conflicting accounts of his activities. Some sources suggest that he stopped appearing in the Kremlin for several days, retreating to his dacha. Others argue that he was in constant communication with generals and ministers, reading reports and signing orders. One of the most dramatic stories comes from Khrushchev's memoirs. He claimed that Stalin was so paralyzed by fear that he did not appear in the Kremlin until June 30. And when his comrades came to fetch him, Stalin supposedly muttered, "Why did you come? Have you come to arrest me?" But historians question this. Documents from those days include orders with Stalin's signature. Generals reported meetings with him. So was Khrushchev's tale of fabrication, designed to diminish his rival's legacy. This mystery remains. For at least several days in June 1941, Stalin seemed to fade from public life. Yet behind the scenes, decisions were still being made, decisions that shaped the survival of the Soviet state. The eye of the hurricane by October 1941, German armies were closing in on Moscow. Panic gripped the city. Government officers evacuated eastward. Crowds fled in chaos. At this moment, many expected Stalin to leave the capital, but he made a fateful choice. He stayed. Stalin's decision to remain in Moscow during the most dangerous weeks of the war became one of the central myths of his leadership. To his followers, it was a sign of unshakable courage. To his critics, it was a carefully calculated gesture designed to inspire morale at a desperate time. On November 7, 1941, with German forces less than 30 kilometers from the Kremlin, Stalin reviewed the Red Army parade on Red Square. Troops marched past the leader and then went directly to the front lines. The message was clear: Moscow would not fall, and the Soviet Union would not surrender. The Supreme Commander on July 19, 1941, Stalin formally became the People's Commissar of Defense. 2 days later, he took the position of Supreme Commander-in-Chief. From this point on, every major military decision required his approval. Stalin was no military genius. His interference often cost lives. Early in the war, he forbade strategic retreats, demanding his generals hold the line at all costs. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed as a result. Millions were captured. The Soviet Union bled because of his stubbornness, but Stalin was also a quick learner. By 1942, he had begun to listen more carefully to his generals, Zhukov, Vasilevsky, Rokossovsky. He still made the final call, but increasingly, the Red Army's operations reflected the advice of professionals rather than the whims of a dictator. The turning point, Stalingrad in late 1942, the tide began to turn. The city that bore his name became the site of one of the most brutal battles in history. Where was Stalin during Stalingrad? He never visited the front, but his presence was felt in every decision. He pushed for relentless resistance, forbade surrender, and personally approved Operation Uranus, the encirclement plan that trapped the German Sixth Army. To the Soviet people, Stalingrad was not only a victory of arms, but a victory of will, and Stalin's will was projected as the force that refused to bend. The global leader as the war dragged on, Stalin's role expanded beyond the battlefield. He became one of the big three, sitting alongside Roosevelt and Churchill at the great conferences of Tehran and Yalta. At these summits, Stalin appeared not as the isolated dictator of the 1930s, but as a world statesman, shaping the post-war order. He bargained, demanded, and secured influence over Eastern Europe. The man who in 1941 seemed on the brink of collapse was by 1945 a victor, one of the most powerful figures on earth. The endgame, Berlin by 1945, the Red Army was unstoppable. Stalin directed the final offensives that would lead to the capture of Berlin. Though he remained in Moscow, far from the front lines, his influence was absolute. Every general knew that ultimate authority lay in the Kremlin. When Hitler died in his bunker and Berlin fell, Stalin declared victory. The man who had once hidden in his dacha, silent and shaken, now stood as the conqueror of Nazi Germany. Conclusion, myth, and reality. So where was Stalin during the war? He was in his dacha, wrestling with despair. He was in the Kremlin, demanding impossible sacrifices. He was in the shadows, pulling strings that moved millions. He was on the world stage, carving up continents. The truth is complex. Stalin was never the heroic commander his propaganda portrayed, nor the helpless coward his enemies described. He was something far more unsettling, a ruthless survivor, a leader who learned through blood, who sacrificed millions to secure his own power and his nation's survival. And as long as the story of World War is told, the question will remain, was Stalin the savior of his country or its greatest tragedy? Before the German tanks rolled across the Soviet border, Europe was a continent on edge. In cities from Paris to Warsaw, people whispered of Hitler's ambitions. Rumors flew. Who would be the next to fall? Governments braced for invasion, soldiers drilled endlessly, and civilians hoarded supplies. Yet, in Moscow, a quiet tension reigned. Stalin, the man who controlled millions, seemed almost detached. Behind the walls of the Kremlin, advisors pleaded for action, yet the leader remained inscrutable, caught between disbelief and strategy. Stalin was never alone in his decisions. Surrounding him were ministers, generals, and secret police, each with their own fears and ambitions. Molotov, Beria, and Zhukov formed a delicate balance of counsel and caution. Meetings stretched for hours, documents piled high on desks, maps of Europe and Soviet territories spread across tables. Some accounts describe Stalin pacing, chain-smoking, eyes scanning every report. Others say he sat motionless, letting his aides argue. The question haunted them: would he act decisively, or was paralysis taking hold of the Kremlin? As German forces advanced, Moscow transformed into a city of urgency. Factories shifted to military production. Hospitals prepared for casualties that seemed inevitable. Citizens dug trenches, erected barricades, and prepared for siege. Yet amidst the chaos, the streets retained a strange calm of forced, tense normality. Stalin's choice to remain in the city was not merely symbolic, it was a statement. Every parade, every public inspection, every signature on an order carried a weight that ordinary soldiers and civilians could feel. Decades later, historians uncovered personal notes and diaries from Stalin's inner circle. These revealed a leader who oscillated between fear and resolve. Some nights, he reportedly could not sleep, haunted by the thought of Moscow falling. Other days, he issued sweeping orders, shaping campaigns hundreds of kilometers away. In these pages, one sees a man wrestling not only with his enemies, but with the burden of absolute power. As frost gripped the land and German armies approached Moscow, the stakes grew higher. Stalin studied maps, spoke with generals, and made decisions that would cost lives. Entire divisions were moved, supplies rationed, and defenses reorganized. His directives were sometimes rigid, forbidding retreat at critical moments, yet over time, he learned to temper his will with advice from seasoned military leaders. The Red Army began to reflect a combination of Stalin's ruthlessness and the professionalism of commanders like Zhukov. Beyond the strategy rooms and battle plans, ordinary people suffered. Letters from soldiers described hunger, frostbite, and fear. Families fled towns only to find chaos in the cities. Yet amid despair, stories of courage emerged, nurses risking their lives to save the wounded, civilians building barricades with their own hands, children running errands through snow-covered streets. Stalin's presence, even if distant, became a psychological anchor. His speeches and occasional appearances reminded millions that the Soviet state endured. By 1943, the war was no longer just a Soviet struggle, it was global. Stalin sat at tables with Roosevelt and Churchill, negotiating strategies that would decide the post-war world. These moments show a man transformed, from an isolated dictator haunted by his nation's fragility to a global statesman, demanding influence, crafting alliances, and ensuring the Soviet Union emerged as a superpower. Every order, every choice carried a dual weight: victory or catastrophe. Millions lived or died as a result. Historians debate endlessly: was Stalin a hero, a tyrant, or simply a survivor of unimaginable pressures? The truth is layered. In his silence, there was calculation. In his speeches, there was performance. In his private moments, there was doubt. The story of Stalin during World War I is not merely the tale of one man, but of a nation teetering on the brink, shaped by his hands. To understand Stalin's war is to confront complexity, the interplay of fear, power, strategy, and survival. It is to see a man whose actions echoed across continents, whose choices shaped millions of lives, and whose legacy continues to provoke debate. Where was Stalin during the darkest days? He was everywhere, in every decision, in every map, in every soldier's march, and in the silent corridors of power. He was a leader of contradictions, a figure of myth and reality intertwined. The calm before the storm. In the weeks leading up to June 22, 1941, the atmosphere in Moscow was tense, but outwardly calm. Citizens went about their daily routines, yet behind the walls of government offices, alarms were raised constantly. Reports from intelligence agencies warned of Hitler's imminent invasion, yet Stalin appeared unmoved. Some historians argue that this calm was a tactical choice. He did not want panic to spread before the first blow fell. Others suggest genuine disbelief. The scale of the German attack seemed almost impossible to imagine. The early days of Barbarossa. As Operation Barbarossa began, chaos erupted across the Western Soviet territories. Cities were bombed, railways destroyed, and communications disrupted. Commanders reported massive losses, encirclements, and the collapse of entire divisions. Meanwhile, Stalin remained in Moscow, his movements meticulously documented yet often contradictory in memoirs and official records. Some say he barely slept, pacing the Kremlin corridors at night, reviewing reports by candlelight, and trying to grasp the full scope of the catastrophe. Ordinary lives amidst the disaster. While generals debated strategy, ordinary citizens faced unimaginable hardships. Families fled towns, soldiers marched without adequate supplies, and famine loomed in the rear lines. Witnesses recall seeing lines at bakeries, overcrowded hospitals, and streets full of refugees. Stalin's absence from public broadcasts during these critical days created a vacuum, a terrifying uncertainty that ordinary people had to fill with rumors and speculation. The Kremlin decision-making machine. Despite appearances, decisions were being made. Stalin convened small councils with his closest generals, Zhukov, Vasilevsky, and Bogini. Maps and reports were scrutinized and orders were drafted continuously. Early mistakes were deadly. Strict no-retreat policies led to encircled armies and massive casualties. Yet over time, Stalin adapted, learning to weigh advice from professional military leaders while still asserting final authority. The tension between stubbornness and pragmatism became a defining feature of his wartime leadership. The psychological warfare. Stalin understood the importance of perception. He knew that the people of Moscow and the Red Army needed to believe in the strength of their leadership. By October 1941, with German forces advancing, Stalin made a bold choice. He would not evacuate. His presence in Moscow was both strategic and psychological, a signal to his people that the city would hold. Every inspection, every public appearance, and every parade became an act of morale building, a demonstration that the Soviet Union would endure. Behind the front lines, even as battles raged in the field, Stalin's influence reached every front line. He studied intelligence reports on troop movements, production schedules, and supply chains. He approved counter-offensives, redirected reinforcements, and coordinated with partisans behind enemy lines. His decisions were often ruthless, cities sacrificed, millions conscripted, and harsh measures imposed to ensure total control. Yet for every loss, there was a calculated gain, a strategy designed to outlast the invaders. Allies and global strategy. As the war progressed, Stalin's role expanded beyond Soviet borders. Conferences in Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam brought him face to face with Roosevelt and Churchill. Negotiations were tense, often confrontational, as Stalin demanded guarantees for Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. These meetings showcased a side of Stalin that contrasted sharply with the fearful man of June 1941, a global strategist negotiating not just for survival but for post-war supremacy. Stalingrad and the turning point. The Battle of Stalingrad marked a pivotal moment. Stalin stayed in Moscow, yet his decisions dictated the battlefield. He insisted on no surrender, pushed for counter-offensives, and personally approved encirclement strategies. The Red Army, exhausted but resolute, executed his plans. Victory at Stalingrad became a turning point not only in military terms but in psychological ones. It transformed the Soviet Union from a nation on the brink of collapse to one capable of defeating Hitler's forces. The final offensive. By 1945, the Red Army advanced relentlessly toward Berlin. Stalin directed campaigns from Moscow, coordinating with generals via radio, courier, and secure communications. His presence was never at the front lines, yet his authority was absolute. Orders dictated troop movements, supply priorities, and even the treatment of civilians in liberated territories. Berlin's fall was as much a result of his strategic oversight as it was the courage of millions of soldiers. Reflections on leadership. Stalin's wartime leadership is a study in contradiction. He could inspire, terrify, and manipulate simultaneously. Millions suffered, yet the Soviet Union survived. The line between heroism and cruelty blurred in every decision he made. His personal doubts, fears, and obsessions shaped history as much as his public persona. Legacy and controversy. Even decades later, historians debate: was Stalin a savior, a tyrant, or both? Did his decisions save the Soviet Union or cost it millions of lives unnecessarily? The truth is complex. Stalin was neither fully heroic nor entirely villainous. He was a survivor, a strategist, and a man whose choices resonated across continents, shaping the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history.